April. And here's what I was looking at, 3.1% on the year-over-year core. Definitely hotter than expected. It's hotter than the rearview mirror at 2.9. 3.1 would equal February. The high reading of the year was 3.3 in January, and that was the highest since May of last year. So if I look at the data on the month-over-month basis, exactly as expected. If I look at the year-over-year, obviously we got a little bit warm on the core.
All right, folks, so we have some breaking economic news, confirmation that Donald Trump's tariffs are indeed increasing inflation, something that he promised he would end on day one in office. He's actually triggering inflation. But before we unpack all that, if you end up liking this video and you want to support the channel, please be sure to hit the like, subscribe, and alert bells before you go. All right, friends, we got a lot to talk about here, but these new numbers are out and not looking good, particularly when Trump promised that he would end inflation in 24 hours. It was an absurd promise, but he made it nonetheless, and we have every right, and I would argue every obligation, to hold him to his promises. So as Governor Gavin Newsom's press office is noting, new data shows inflation is soaring as Trump's tariffs intensify. So on coffee, let me take a look at this because the screen is kind of small. Cookies, peanut butter, canned vegetables, canned fruits, Cuban products, dried beans, fresh vegetables, frozen fruits. Let's see if I can get this even bigger. There we go. Spices, seasoning, condiments, processed fish and seafood, breakfast cereals, chicken, carbonated drinks, pork, inflation all rising. I will note that this report does say that egg prices are down, so call balls and strikes and give the devil his due. Egg prices are declining on Trump's watch after he increased them, but we're seeing a lot of price hikes on groceries and everyday goods. Now, Trump himself is panicking about this report and trying to distract from it and trying to assure his cultists that basically they should not believe their lying eyes and don't believe the data. Trillions of dollars are being taken in by tariffs, which has been incredible for our country, its stock market, its general wealth, and just about everything else. It's been proven, even at this late stage, tariffs have not caused inflation or any other problems for America other than massive amounts of cash pouring into our Treasury's coffers. Also, it's been shown that for the most part, consumers aren't even paying these tariffs. It's mostly companies and governments, many of them foreign, picking up the tabs. But David Solomon and Goldman Sachs refuse to give credit where credit is due. They made a bad prediction a long time ago on both the market repercussion and the tariffs themselves, and they were wrong, just like they are wrong about so much else. I think that David should go out and get himself a new economist, or maybe he should just ought to focus on being a DJ and not bother running a major financial institution. So this is Trump saying again, sure, 3.1% inflation, but that's fake news. Ignore it. Everything's bad. People who criticize me are bad. He's hoping that these numbers do not proliferate, but we're going to do everything in our power to make sure they do, and that people know who to attribute the pain to. Heather Long, a Washington Post economic reporter, says just in, tariffs are starting to cause pain for consumers, but the impact is modest so far. CPI inflation was 2.7% year over year in July, which was below expectation. For the month of July alone, inflation ticked up 0.2%. A big decline in gas prices helped offset the rising cost of airline fares, recreation, household furnishings, and used cars. Core inflation, excluding volatile food and energy, hit 3.1% in July, first time above 3% since February. So again, to be clear, it's not like inflation is skyrocketing to 9% or anything like that, but it is increasing because of Trump's tariffs. And Trump, of course, will try to take credit and say, well, the increase isn't massive. The increase isn't stratospheric. But you promised that it wouldn't increase at all. You said that you would cut costs for American consumers on day one, and objectively, costs are increasing on Trump's watch. Economist Justin Wolfers points out, latest inflation data just arrived, came right in at the consensus forecast. Headline inflation of 0.2% in the last month, running at 2.7% year over year. Core rose 0.3% in July and 3.1% over the year. For 2 years, inflation was declining towards the Fed target. That seems to be over. So under Biden, because of post-COVID supply shocks and delays in inflation, global inflation, the Biden administration and the Federal Reserve under Biden, Jerome Powell included, managed this where inflation was dropping. 2 years. for the most part. It's trending downward. Trump has reversed that with his tariffs. He's stopped it. He's halted that momentum and reversing it. It's now slowly ticking upward on his watch. It's insane. This is one of those things where if he would have just coasted, rested on the laurels of the economy that he'd inherited, as he did for the first 3 years for the most part of his first term when he inherited President Obama's economy, he could have done. He shouldn't have done it. It would have been dishonest, but he would have been able to say, hey, listen, look how great the economy is under me. Just again, coasting on what he'd inherited. Instead, he took ridiculous, absurd tariff action that even conservative economists begged him not to take. And as a consequence, a direct one-to-one consequence, a straight line from Trump's tariffs to inflation. Stupid. And that's why it's very, very important that we properly attribute the blame. This did not happen because of an external crisis. This did not happen because of a once-in-a-century pandemic. This happened because Donald Trump actively, deliberately chose to trigger this global trade war and double down on it and then roll it out in the most absurd way. There's so many exit ramps before him over the past 6 months, and he has declined again and again and again to take them. David Pakman notes Trump's economy by the numbers. July's inflation spike was the largest in 6 months. Layoffs just hit their highest level since the pandemic. Manufacturing saw the biggest decline in years. Going really well? Indeed, it's not. Democratic Congressman Richie Torres says core CPI inflation has climbed above 3%. The Trump tariff policy is a self-inflicted wound that keeps on inflicting. Higher tariffs mean higher prices, period. Democratic strategist Mike Nellis says, I was laughed at on Fox News for suggesting inflation was rising, but the numbers don't lie. Core inflation rose 0.3% in July and 3.1% year over year. The pace is accelerating, and that's before most of Trump's tariffs have taken effect. August will get worse unless Trump reverses course. Let's take a look at a New York Times economic analysis, which breaks the new data down. U.S. inflation report shows effects of Trump's tariffs. A gauge of underlying inflation in July showed prices increasing at the fastest annual pace in 5 months, a sign that businesses are passing along tariff-related costs to customers. A key measure of underlying inflation rose in July as Donald Trump's tariffs intensified price pressures across a wider range of consumer goods and services, although the overall increase was not likely significant enough to deter the Federal Reserve from lowering interest rates at its next meeting in September. The Consumer Price Index stayed steady at 2.7% compared to the same time last year. On a monthly basis, prices rose 0.2% from June. But an important gauge tracking consumer prices that strips out volatile food and energy prices accelerated more rapidly. Core CPI, which is closely watched by the central bank, jumped 0.3% over the course of the month, or 3.1% on a year-over-year basis. That is one of the largest monthly increases so far this year and represents the fastest annual pace in 5 months. In June, core inflation rose 0.2% from the previous month, or 2.9% from July 2024. The July data, which was released by the Bureau of Labor Statistics, provides a clear sign that businesses are more readily passing along tariff-related costs to their customers after a prolonged period in which price gains were muted. Still, the price gains came in more or less as expected, suggesting the central bank can move ahead with plans to soon start cutting interest rates that it put on hold in December. U.S. companies that import products have largely been able to hold off on raising prices despite a universal 10% tariff that's been in place on all imports since April, along with higher levies on steel, aluminum, and products from China and Canada. Trump's more punishing tariffs on individual countries went into effect on August 7th, and so will not be reflected in the July data, something else to keep in mind. Businesses have managed to avoid passing along price increases because of strategy earlier in the year to stockpile goods that were likely to be subject to Trump's levies. Many companies have also sought to absorb the cost themselves in order to avoid driving away customers, some of whom are under increasingly financial strain. But the July data showed more businesses reaching a tipping point, left with little option but to raise prices following June's notable uptick. The biggest impact so far has been concentrated in categories such as furniture, appliances, and other household wares, as well as recreation goods and footwear. In July, the broader households furnishing index rose 0.7% in June, following a 1% increase in June. That sentence is kind of confusing. I don't know if they added June twice, but a bit redundant. Compared to the same time last year, those prices are up 2.4%. Recreation-related prices rose 0.4%. Some of the larger gains in July came in apparel and footwear, categories that are exposed to tariffs on countries around the world, including India, Vietnam, and China. Prices on infants and toddlers apparel were up 3.3% in July. Footwear was up 1.4%. Airfares rose sharply after several months of declines, increasing 4% in July. Hotel-related expenses continue to be muted, however. New and used vehicle price increases have stayed relatively steady or relatively subdued as car makers have shielded their customers from Trump's duties rather than forcing them to bear the brunt of the higher costs. That changed in July, with used car and truck prices rising 0.5%. New vehicle prices, however, were flat for the month. A sharp drop in energy prices helped offset rising costs elsewhere, which kept the headline inflation figure steady. The overall energy index dropped 1.1%, with gas prices down 2.2%. Americans have become choosier about how they spend as hiring across the country slowed in recent months. July's jobs report showed just 73,000 jobs added for the month, and gains registered in May and June were revised down by an unusually high total of 258,000 positions. Companies have yet to lay off workers in droves, but economists worry that they will be forced to cut back on costs as tariffs continue to eat into their margins. Tuesday's data is important for the Federal Reserve, which is facing a challenging economic situation in which prices are rising while the labor market is weakening. It's a difficult backdrop given the Fed's duty to keep inflation low and stable while also ensuring that unemployment rates do not rise too much. Officials at the central bank have kept interest rates steady since the start of the year as they've sought more clarity on how Trump's policies, including tariffs, would impact the economy. That approach has attracted significant criticism from Trump, who's taken to directly insulting Jerome Powell, the chair of the central bank, as well as the powerful board of governors that he heads. Trump last week announced that he would install a temporary governor to join the board, which votes on interest rates at every policy meeting. A vacancy unexpectedly opened up at the start of the month when Adriana Klugler, a governor, announced that she was leaving before her term was set to expire at the end of January. Trump tapped a longstanding critic of the Fed, Stephen Moran, who most recently served as chair of Trump's Council of Economic Advisors. Moran, who must still be confirmed by the Senate, will join a group of Fed officials who have started to splinter over the right time to restart interest rate cuts that were paused in December. Two policymakers previously appointed by Trump have already called for the Fed to cut interest rates. More policymakers appear to be joining that camp following the most recent data that showed far less monthly job growth since the start of the summer than initially expected. Earlier this summer, Powell conceded that if not for tariffs, the Fed likely would have reduced borrowing costs already, which makes sense. We've talked about that. But for Trump's disastrous tariff policy, we would see interest rates cuts. It's Trump's fault. Trump is being hoisted by his own petard. I love that phrase. July's inflation report is also the first big economic data release from the Bureau of Labor Statistics since Trump fired its head over the weaker than expected jobs report. Trump claimed without evidence that the previous head, Erica McIntyre, had run the agency since 2021, had rigged the federal hiring data to harm him politically. Economists decried that move, warning that any attempt to undermine what's always been considered reliable, independently produced statistics from the government agency would be economically and financially damaging. On Monday, Trump announced his decision to nominate E.J. Antoni, an economist at the Conservative Heritage Foundation who has criticized the BLS in the past. We'll probably talk about him in a separate video. There you have it, folks. It's an economic analysis breaking down the data. The bottom line is this, that inflation is rising under Trump. Trump promised to cut it in 24 hours, that he would reduce prices. He is increasing prices as a consequence of his tariffs, even though companies across this country have been desperately trying to hold off passing the increased prices onto consumers. They are finally having to give. They are having to relent to the laws of economics, and it's Trump's fault. And he's hoping that he can distract you from that fact, but he's not going to, because Americans feel the pinch already, and we're seeing it as his reports indicates, and as some of the other things I showed you indicate. Very specific goods that people get every damn day and rely on are increasing on Trump's watch. And we have to make sure that there's a political consequence to this in the 2026 midterms. In the meantime, let me know what you think in the comments.